My mother-in-law brought a fake lawyer to steal my inherited house. She had no idea I'm a real one, and I was ready for her. It started on what should have been a quiet weekend at the beach house, our peaceful escape from the chaos of the city, and more importantly, from her. My wife Stacy and I were halfway through breakfast when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Patty, my mother-in-law, standing there like she owned the place, lips pursed, blazer too tight, and a stranger beside her with a cheap briefcase and a confused look in his eyes. I brought legal help, she said, as if she were doing us a favor. What she didn't know was that this was my domain. I let her talk. I let her think she had control, and then I turned the tables and made sure everyone saw exactly who she really was. Before everything spiraled into legal chaos and betrayal, there was just Stacy and me, two people trying to build a life together. We met during our second year of law school over lukewarm coffee and shared notes from a brutal constitutional law professor. I was immediately drawn to her, not just because she was beautiful, but because she had this rare mix of fire and grace. Stacy didn't just talk about making a difference, she acted on it. She was the kind of person who stood up for the kid getting bullied, even if it meant putting herself at risk. I, on the other hand, was scrappy. I worked nights as a server, hustled internships during breaks, and juggled student loans like a circus act. Stacy came from a completely different world, one with vacation homes, private schools, and a mother who hosted charity galas for fun. But she never made me feel less than. In fact, she admired my grit and my determination to climb up without shortcuts. When we started dating seriously, she introduced me to her family. Her dad was quiet but kind, the type of man who showed affection through fixing things and long, thoughtful silences. And then there was Patty, her mother. The first time I met her, she looked me up and down like I was a car she wasn't sure was worth test driving. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I brushed it off. Stacy was what mattered. I told myself Patty would come around eventually. She just needed to see that I was serious. So I bent over backward. I went to her family's over-the-top Thanksgiving dinners, helped hang lights at their winter parties, and even wore a hideous Easter sweater to a brunch that felt more like a photo shoot than a family gathering. Patty never said anything outright cruel. She preferred the death by a thousand cuts method, subtle digs cloaked in compliments. You're a lawyer? That's so cute. My nephew's at Yale Law. Maybe he can give you some pointers. Or, Stacy always did love a project. Still, I swallowed my pride for Stacy. When her father had a minor stroke, I dropped a court brief and drove us 3 hours to the hospital. I slept in an uncomfortable chair for 2 nights while Stacy paced the ICU floor. Patty never thanked me. In fact, she seemed annoyed I was even there. After he recovered, Stacy and I got engaged. That was the first big battle. Patty tried to plan the entire wedding like it was her own second shot at a fairy tale. Stacy stood her ground, though. She refused to let her mother dictate our day. I watched her grow stronger through that process and saw her finally push back against years of conditioning. We got married in a small ceremony by the lake. It was intimate, imperfect, and completely us. Patty pouted the whole time, but we didn't care. We were starting our life. We moved into a cozy starter home just outside the city. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Stacy worked in publishing, and I was grinding my way through a junior associate position. We were stretched thin, but stupidly in love. Even when Patty dropped in unannounced, critiquing our furniture or questioning our financial decisions, I kept the peace. I wanted harmony more than I wanted to be right. Then came the beach house. My uncle, who'd always supported me like a second father, passed away unexpectedly and left us his old place by the coast. It was a bit run down, full of quirks, but it had soul. Stacy and I saw it as our retreat, a space just for us, away from everything. But from the moment Patty heard about it, something shifted. Her polite disapproval turned into veiled possessiveness. "It's too much responsibility for you two," she said more than once. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Stacy brushed it off. I tried to, but deep down, I felt it. Patty didn't see this house as ours. She saw it as an extension of her control. And me, I was just the obstacle standing in the way. Still, I believed we could make it work. I had no idea that this house would become the battleground for a war I didn't start, but was damn sure going to finish. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment the unease started growing in my chest. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small, almost imperceptible things that began to wear me down over time. After we inherited the beach house, Patty's behavior shifted. She wasn't just critical anymore, she was possessive. It started with her uninvited visits. The beach house was 2 hours from her place, but somehow she'd find herself in the area every other weekend. Stacy and I would arrive expecting peace and quiet, only to find Patty's SUV parked out front, or worse, her already inside, making herself tea like she lived there. Stacy would laugh it off. She just wants to be part of our lives, she'd say. But I knew better. Patty wasn't trying to connect, she was testing boundaries. And the more we let her get away with it, the bolder she became. One afternoon, we came back from a walk on the beach to find the kitchen rearranged. The spices were in different cabinets, and our dishes were stacked differently. Stacy looked confused, but Patty waved it off with a breezy, "I was just helping you organize. You'll thank me later." I didn't thank her. I changed the locks. But Patty wasn't deterred. A week later, we found a new throw pillow on the couch, one neither of us had bought. Then came a set of curtains in the guest room and a new doormat that read, "Home is where the heart is." Stacy insisted it was sweet, but I felt invaded. This wasn't generosity, it was infiltration. I confronted her gently the next time she visited. "Patty, I appreciate your help, but this is our space. We'd prefer to decorate it ourselves." Her smile froze. "I'm just trying to make it feel like home for everyone. Don't be so sensitive." That's when I realized she didn't see this as our home, she saw it as hers, or at least something she had a stake in, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I started noticing other things too. A drawer I knew I'd closed would be open. The thermostat would be adjusted. Stacy thought I was imagining it, so I stopped mentioning it, but the feeling of being watched, of being monitored, didn't go away. Then one day I got a call from our neighbor, Mr. Ellison, a retired Navy vet who lived 2 doors down. "Saw someone poking around your place yesterday," he said. "Big hair, loud voice. Didn't look like she belonged." I didn't need a photo, I knew it was Patty. When I brought it up to Stacy, she tried to give her mom the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just checking in, she offered. "No one checks in by trespassing," I said, and that night I installed discreet cameras only in the common areas, but enough to catch what I needed. Sure enough, within days I had footage of Patty letting herself in with a key I hadn't given her. When I showed Stacy the footage, something changed in her expression. "She copied it," she said, her voice flat. Stacy called her immediately. There was yelling, denial, tears. Patty claimed she was just making sure everything was okay. "You're so busy," she said. "I thought I could help." Stacy told her to stay away from the house, Patty agreed. For a while, but Patty's version of staying away didn't include giving up. She just switched tactics from sneaky to strategic. And it all came to a head when she showed up one morning with a man she introduced as her legal advisor. That moment, standing on the porch with a half-eaten bagel in my hand and a faux lawyer grinning nervously beside my mother-in-law, was when I realized she'd officially lost her mind. Patty didn't think of herself as a villain. She thought she was saving her daughter from a man who didn't deserve her. And the beach house? That was just a symbol. She needed to control it because she couldn't control me. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd spent years being underestimated, and I was done pretending I didn't see what was happening. I didn't know it at the time, but that Saturday morning marked the turning point. Until then, Patty had stayed within the shadows of passive aggression, dressing up her control as a concern, her manipulation as motherly love. But when she walked into our beach house with a fake lawyer and a folder full of fraudulent documents, she dropped the mask completely. Stacy and I were mid-breakfast, a peaceful routine we'd come to treasure. Bagels, black coffee, a soft indie playlist in the background. Then came the knock. Stacy peeked out the window and let out a sharp breath. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. There stood Patty, dressed like she was heading to a country club board meeting. Hair sculpted to perfection, lipstick a little too bold for the morning. And beside her was a man who looked like he'd gotten lost on his way to a Halloween party. He was trying for attorney, but the briefcase was falling apart and the collar of his shirt was stained. "I brought someone who can help clarify things," Patty said as I opened the door. She breezed past us as she lived there, dropping a manila folder on the kitchen table with dramatic flair. "These," she announced, "are the papers to transfer the beach house to me. For safekeeping, legacy reasons. You'll thank me later." Stacy stood frozen, mouth open. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "And who's this?" "This is Todd," she said, gesturing to the man behind her. "My legal advisor." I turned to Todd. "Nice to meet you. What law school did you graduate from?" Todd blinked. "Well, technically I'm still studying. Independent." I raised an eyebrow. "Got a bar number?" He laughed nervously. "It's pending." Stacy's face darkened. "Mom, you brought a fake lawyer to our house." "He's helping me," Patty snapped. "You two don't understand what's at stake." "I do," I said, "which is why I'm telling you that this," I pointed to the folder, "isn't just absurd, it's illegal. Do you want us to sign over property you have no claim to based on fake legal counsel? That's fraud." Patty's face flushed, but she doubled down. "You're being dramatic. This is a family matter." "No," Stacy said sharply. "This is manipulation and we're done." Todd mumbled something about needing to be somewhere and scurried out the door. Patty, red-faced and flustered, followed close behind, but not before tossing over her shoulder, "You'll regret this. You're tearing this family apart." That should have been the end of it, but for someone like Patty, being told no was simply the first move in a longer game. Within a week, Stacy started getting texts from family members, vague questions, concern-laced messages. "He heard you and your mom had a falling out? Is everything okay with the house? Patty seems really heartbroken." Patty had launched a smear campaign. She spun a narrative where I was controlling, where I'd isolated Stacy from her family, brainwashed her, and turned her against her poor, well-meaning mother. And while some relatives rolled their eyes, those who knew Patty's flair for drama, others weren't so quick to dismiss her. One afternoon, Stacy's Aunt Beverly called. "I don't understand, honey," she said. "Your mom says you're pushing her away." "She tried to steal our house," Stacy replied flatly. "She said it was a misunderstanding. She showed up with a fake lawyer and forged documents." A long pause. But Patty wasn't finished. She began showing up to family events in full martyr mode, eyes brimming with tears, voice quivering as she told half-truths and painted herself as the victim. It was manipulative theater at its finest. And the worst part? Some people bought it. Then came the call that changed everything. Stacy's cousin Claire worked in HR at Patty's company. "Hey," she said hesitantly, "just so you know, your mom got fired." "What?" Stacy blinked. She was using company computers to search property records, sending emails about, legal stuff. IT got it. Patty had gotten herself fired, trying to find a loophole, a thread to pull to unravel our claim on the beach house. You'd think that would be the end of it. But then we got the letter, an actual attorney this time, a lawsuit. Patty was suing us for partial ownership of the beach house, claiming she had financially contributed to its maintenance and therefore had legal interest. Stacy stared at the letter, then at me. "She's suing us?" I nodded, already flipping through our files. "Yep, and now it's official." The lawsuit alleged that Patty had paid for repairs, that she'd overseen improvements, and that there was a verbal agreement giving her claim. All of it was a lie. But in court, perception could be as powerful as proof if not countered, so I began assembling the receipts. I had records of every payment made from our joint account, emails with contractors, and dated invoices. I made spreadsheets. I color-coded timelines. Stacy watched me work, alternating between rage and disbelief. How can she just lie like this? She's counting on us giving up, I said. She thinks if she keeps applying pressure, we'll cave, but she picked the wrong battle and the wrong guy. For weeks, we lived in prep mode. Our house turned into a mini war room. Patty had forced us into a legal battle, but this time, it was on my turf. The day the court summons arrived, something shifted in both of us. Stacy sat quietly on the porch, holding the letter like it was a grenade that hadn't gone off yet. Do you think she'll actually show up? She asked. She'll show, I said. She wants the performance. She wants the attention. Stacy shook her head. I just don't get it. She's my mother. How did we get here? I didn't have an answer. What I did have were files, neatly organized, fact-based evidence that would do the talking for us. But even with all the legal armor, a small part of me ached for Stacy. No matter how justified we were, no one wins in a family war. I reached over and took her hand. She underestimated you, I said quietly. She doesn't realize that you're not the same girl she used to push around, and she has no idea what she's up against. Stacy gave me a faint smile. Let's make sure she learns. The weeks leading up to the court date were the hardest part. It wasn't the lawsuit itself. I knew the case was weak, flimsy even. As a lawyer, I had full confidence in our evidence and our legal standing. What shook me wasn't the courtroom. It was the emotional toll it took on Stacy. At first, she was furious, righteous, indignant, and ready to fight. But that fire faded into something quieter, an exhaustion that seeped into her bones. I'd find her staring at her phone, reading the same old texts from relatives who had taken her mom's side. She'd scroll through them again and again, searching for meaning or logic that wasn't there. She's turned everyone against me, Stacy whispered one night, curled up beside me on the couch. People I grew up with, people who were like second parents, they believe her. Not all of them, I said gently. And the ones who do, maybe they were never really in your corner to begin with. He didn't reply, just nestled closer. Sleep became scarce. Stacy would lie awake, staring at the ceiling while I pretended to be asleep, hoping she wouldn't notice the way I was clenching my jaw. We started keeping a nightlight on again, something we hadn't done in years. The dark felt heavier than it used to. Patty didn't stop. Even with the lawsuit pending, she found ways to insert herself into our lives. Mutual acquaintances would pass along messages. She says she still loves you. She's just scared. She's doing this for the family. It made Stacy question everything. What if she really believes this is helping? She asked me one evening. I looked at her. Does that matter? Stacy thought about it, then shook her head. No, I guess it doesn't. One night, I found her at the kitchen table surrounded by old photo albums. Childhood birthdays, Christmas mornings, school dances. Patty was in all of them, smiling, holding Stacy close, beaming with pride. But those images felt like they belonged to a different woman, someone who had vanished. I miss her, Stacy said, tears spilling over. Not who she is now, but who she used to be, or maybe who I thought she was. I sat down beside her, flipping a page. It's okay to grieve that, because that's what this was. Grief, not for a death, but for the loss of something just as deep, trust. The belief that blood meant safety, that love was unconditional. Stacy had to mourn the mother she never truly had. We kept preparing for court, but our home felt different, like it was holding its breath. I tried to keep things light, brought home flowers, cooked her favorite meals, and even found old episodes of shows we used to binge during law school. It helped, but only a little. The pressure wore on me, too, more than I admitted. At work, I found myself distracted, replaying arguments in my head and organizing rebuttals in my sleep. I was snappier than usual. One day, I almost snapped at a junior associate for messing up a file. I caught myself just in time. Stacy noticed. You okay? I'm fine, I lied. She reached for my hand. You don't have to carry it alone. But I did, because I was the one who could fight this the way it needed to be fought, and deep down, I was scared. scared that if I lost, I wouldn't just be losing a house, I'd be letting her down. The night before the hearing, Stacy couldn't sleep. Neither could I. We sat in silence, sipping tea. She looked at me with a kind of quiet desperation. What if, what if we don't win? We will, I said, trying to sound confident. But what if we don't? I looked her in the eye, then we still have each other, and that's enough. She nodded, but I knew it wasn't enough for her. Not really. She needed closure. She needed to face the woman who broke her heart and look her in the eye one last time. And I needed to make damn sure she left that courtroom knowing we had done everything we could to protect what was ours, not just the house, but our future. Whatever happened the next day, it wasn't just a legal battle. Personal, it was war. And we were walking in with scars already formed. Before we turned in that night, Stacy reached into the drawer beside our bed and pulled out the key to the beach house. She held it in her hand for a long moment, then pressed it into mine. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said softly, that place is ours. No one gets to take that from us. It was more than just a key. It was a reminder of everything we'd built, everything we'd defended, and everything we were about to stand up for. And in that moment, I stopped being afraid. I was ready. The courthouse that morning felt colder than it should have. Maybe it was the steel and glass architecture or the way the fluorescent lights drained color from everything. Or maybe it was just the weight of what we were about to face. Stacy gripped my hand tightly as we walked through the security check, her fingers cold but steady. Our lawyer met us at the front. She was calm, organized, and confident, exactly what we needed. But even as I briefed her one last time on our documentation, I could see the strain on Stacy's face. This wasn't just about facts and contracts for her. This was about a lifetime of wounds she'd tried to ignore, finally demanding to be seen. We entered the courtroom, and there she was, Patty, perfectly dressed, overly made up, sitting straight-backed at the plaintiff's table like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama. Her real attorney, an older man with the look of someone used to stretching truths, sat beside her flipping through notes. He looked bored. She looked smug. Stacy didn't say a word as we sat down. She didn't need to. I could feel her pulse in her wrist, rapid and shallow. When the judge entered, the room was hushed. We stood, we sat, the formalities began. Patty's lawyer opened with a dramatic speech about family, legacy, and Patty's selfless efforts to maintain the beach house. He called her a pillar of support. Stacy let out a breath that was almost a laugh. I reached for her hand beneath the table. Then Patty was called to the stand. She walked up with such practiced grace it made my stomach turn. Her voice was gentle, full of false humility. I only ever wanted to help my daughter and her husband. They were overwhelmed. The house needed so much work. She went on about plumbing issues she supposedly paid for, landscaping she coordinated, and expenses she covered without expecting anything in return. It was a performance. Every word laced with the implication that we were ungrateful, irresponsible, and cruel. When it was our turn, I stood, calm, deliberate, asked questions she couldn't answer, dates she couldn't recall, payment methods she couldn't prove. You said you paid for roof repairs in April. Do you have a receipt? Well, no, it was mostly in cash to a handyman. Do you remember his name? She blanked. No. And these landscaping services, did you get a quote, an invoice, even a text message? She shifted in her seat. It was all verbal. I trusted them. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have here itemized receipts for every repair made to the property since it was inherited. All are paid through our joint account. None of these payments match the timeline or description provided by the plaintiff. The judge took the folder and began to flip through the documentation. Silence fell. Then it was Stacy's turn. She didn't want to speak, but she needed to. When she took the stand, her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. My mother has always had control issues, Stacy said quietly. She doesn't see boundaries. When we got to the house, she acted like it belonged to her. She entered without permission. She left notes. She tried to convince people we couldn't handle it. And when we asked her to stop, she escalated. She brought a fake lawyer to our home. That made the courtroom shift a little. Even Patty's attorney looked uncomfortable. Stacy continued, "This isn't about money, it's about control. And it's taken me a long time to see that, but I do now. I see it clearly." Her voice cracked at the end, but she didn't cry. She didn't need to. The judge asked a few more questions. Then she leaned back in her chair, hands steepled in front of her face. "I've reviewed the evidence presented, and I find no legal basis for the plaintiff's claims. Furthermore, I see a disturbing pattern of manipulation, unsupported accusations, and emotional coercion. Case dismissed." It's done. Just like that. Stacy didn't cheer. I didn't fist pump. We just sat there in stunned silence as Patty's expression crumbled from self-satisfaction to disbelief. We left the courtroom without looking back. Outside, the sun was bright and almost too warm. Stacy took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She actually thought she was going to win, she said. "She always thinks she's right," I replied. We didn't go celebrate. We didn't call anyone. We just went home. Stacy curled up on the couch and fell asleep mid-sentence, the first peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. That night, I stood alone on the porch, the key to the beach house in my hand, feeling not triumphant, but still calm. Cold wasn't over, but we had won the first real battle. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we'd come out of this stronger than we were before. For a while, it felt like peace had finally found us. The house was ours. The court had spoken. Patty's claws had been pried off our lives, at least legally. Stacy was lighter, calmer, and even laughing again. We spent a weekend at the beach house shortly after the hearing, and I remember watching her sit on the porch, feet up, hair messy from the sea breeze, just existing. It was beautiful. She was beautiful. And I thought, maybe that chapter is truly closed. But peace, we learned, is fragile. It started subtly. Mutual friends would mention Patty in passing. "She's been laying low," one said. "Says she's focusing on her healing," said another. We rolled our eyes, but we didn't worry. Stacy didn't even flinch when someone told her Patty had started attending some online therapy group. "Good," she said. "Maybe she'll finally work on herself." Then came the calls. Not from Patty, from extended family, cousins, old family friends, and even someone from Patty's church, all concerned, all parroting the same line. "She misses you. She's trying. She knows she went too far. Don't you think it's time to forgive?" Forgive. That word burned. Stacy would hang up and pace the living room, muttering to herself, "They don't get it. They didn't live it." One night, her cousin Brenda called again, her voice softer than usual. "Look, I'm not saying you need to let her back in. I'm just saying she's alone, and it's eating her up." Stacy didn't respond at first. Then she whispered, "Yeah, and what about what she did to me, to us?" Brenda sighed. "I'm not defending her, Jess. I'm just saying people can change. I've seen worse. Maybe, but I hadn't." It all came to a head when we got an invitation in the mail, a thick cream envelope, our names written in Patty's perfect cursive. Stacy opened it and froze. It was an invite to a family reconciliation dinner, held at Patty's house, complete with RSVP cards, a catered menu, and a line that read, "Let's come back together, life is too short." Stacy stared at the paper like it was toxic. I took it from her, looked it over, then quietly tore it in half. "She hasn't changed," I said. Stacy nodded slowly. "No, she's just changing tactics." And she was. Patty wasn't trying to win through court anymore. She was trying to win through narrative, reframe herself as the victim, the wounded mother, the one abandoned. It worked on some people, enough that Stacy started questioning her own reality again. "Maybe I was too harsh," she muttered one night. "Maybe she really does think she was helping." I didn't tell her what I knew, that this was classic narcissistic behavior, that I'd seen this kind of manipulation before, that guilt was just another tool in Patty's belt. but Stacy had to arrive at that truth herself. So we waited, and then the final straw, it was a Sunday afternoon when we got the call. Not from Patty, from a contractor. Hi, this is Ben. We spoke last year about some landscaping work on your property. Your mother-in-law called us again, said she was authorized to schedule updates. I blinked. Excuse me? Yeah, she wanted to rebook the project from last summer. New shrubs, stone path, the whole thing. Said she'd pay up front. She's not authorized, I said, voice flat. And if she shows up, you call the police. The man hesitated. Will do, sir. I hung up and looked at Stacy, who'd overheard the entire thing. Her face was blank. She's doing it again, Stacy said. I nodded. She never stopped. Stacy stood up. Then I will. That night, she wrote a letter, not to Patty, to the rest of the family, a calm, composed explanation of everything that had happened, the lies, the lawsuit, the manipulation. She didn't ask for sides. She asked for understanding, for space, for respect. She signed it, folded it, and sent it out. Then she blocked Patty's number, for good this time. I watched her do it without hesitation. I'm done, she said, no more relapses. And I believed her. The next few days were strangely quiet. Stacy kept checking her phone like part of her expected Patty to find a new way in, through another number, another account, maybe even a letter slipped under the door. But nothing came, and that silence, oddly enough, felt louder than all of Patty's antics. We spent more time at the beach house again, painted the kitchen a soft yellow, replaced the rickety chairs on the porch. Stacy started planting flowers by the fence, her hands in the dirt, face turned to the sun. I'd watch her from the window, a quiet steadiness in her posture that hadn't been there before. One evening, as the tide came in and the sky turned cotton candy pink, Stacy sat beside me and said, I think this is the first time in my life I've chosen peace over guilt. I didn't say anything. I just wrapped my arm around her and held her close. That night, as we lay in bed listening to the waves, she whispered, Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I almost gave up on myself. I kissed her temple. You fought too, I said, and you finally won. We both knew this wasn't the end of Patty forever. People like her rarely vanish, but it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where Stacy had reclaimed her voice. And that was everything. Few months passed. For the first time in years, life felt ordinary. Gloriously, beautifully ordinary. Stacy got promoted at work. I won a case I'd been chasing for almost a year. We celebrated with champagne and pizza on the beach house porch, watching the tide roll in and laughing like we hadn't in a long time. The quiet was no longer tense. It was safe. And then, out of nowhere, Stacy's phone buzzed one afternoon with a number she didn't recognize. She stared at the screen for a beat. Should I answer it? I shrugged. Your call. She answered on speaker. Hi, honey, it's me, Patty. Stacy's breath caught in her throat. I reached for her hand under the table. I know you don't want to hear from me, Patty continued, voice soft, practiced. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. Stacy didn't speak, her jaw tightened. I messed up. I lost my way. I've been seeing someone, a therapist, real one this time, not just for show. And I realized I hurt you deeply. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say it. Stacy finally spoke. Why now? Patty hesitated. Because I'm sick. Stage 2 breast cancer. I start treatment next week. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I'm not trying to manipulate you, she added quickly. I know how that sounds. I didn't want you to hear it from someone else. After a pause, Stacy replied, voice steady. Thank you for telling me. I hope your treatment goes well. And she hung up. No dramatics, no breakdown. Just silence again. She stood up and walked outside. I followed. For a while, we didn't talk, just listened to the waves crash. Finally, she whispered, I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. You don't have to know, I said. It's okay to feel nothing or everything. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I don't want her back in my life, but I don't want her to die thinking I hate her. She knows you don't, I said. But that doesn't mean you owe her access to your peace. Stacy stayed quiet. Then she whispered, I think I'll send her a card. Just once, wishing her strength. That's it. I squeezed her hand. That's more than fair. She sent the card a few days later, no return address, no promises of reconciliation, just a handwritten note that said, I hope treatment brings you healing in every way. Patty never responded, and maybe that was for the best. Months passed, seasons changed, and eventually so did our lives. The beach house became our full-time home. Stacy left her job to start her own design firm. I scaled back my hours and started teaching part-time at a local law school. We built something new, not in spite of the chaos, but because of it. Every now and then we'd hear a whisper about Patty through the grapevines. She was still in treatment. She'd moved in with a friend. She'd started writing in a journal. Maybe she really was changing. Maybe not. But by then, it didn't matter because we weren't defined by her anymore. We were our own family, and we were finally free. The freedom was subtle at first, less like breaking chains, more like waking up without a weight on your chest. We didn't realize how much of our day-to-day had revolved around anticipating Patty's next move until there was no more need to. We started hosting small gatherings at the beach house, friends, chosen family, people who made us feel safe. Stacy hung fairy lights in the backyard, and I installed a fire pit. On cool nights, we'd all gather with mugs of hot cider, laughter rising into the star-speckled sky. Once, during one of those nights, a friend asked Stacy, "Do you ever think you'll speak to your mom again?" Stacy stirred her drink, thoughtful. Maybe, but on my terms, and never at the cost of myself. There was a strength in her voice I hadn't heard before, not defiance, just certainty. Healing didn't come all at once. Some days, she still woke up from dreams where Patty had found another way in. On other days, she'd hear a phrase, a laugh, a scent, and flinch. Trauma doesn't disappear, it integrates. And she was learning to live with it, not in spite of it. As for me, I realized something too. I'd spent years trying to shield Stacy, to be her armor, but what she really needed, what we both needed, was space to grow beyond survival. The beach house became that space, not because it was free of ghosts, but because we had reclaimed it. Every scratch on the wood floors, every new paint color, every meal cooked in its tiny kitchen, it was all ours now. We had turned a battleground into a home. One night, as we were cleaning up after a small dinner party, Stacy paused by the window. You know, she said, for a long time, I thought loving her meant accepting her poison. I set down the dishes, and now I know love shouldn't feel like debt. That stuck with me. And maybe that's the true ending of this story. Not that Patty vanished, not that justice was served in a clean, cathartic arc, but Stacy broke the cycle. We chose peace. That we learned love can exist without pain, without performance, and without strings. And that sometimes walking away isn't giving up. It's the bravest thing you'll ever do. A year later, the beach house was no longer a battleground, it was home. We threw a small party, close friends and a few cousins. Stacy baked and I grilled. The sun melted into the ocean like it always did, and for once, there was no shadow of Patty looming in the background. That night, after everyone left, we stood on the porch in silence. I never thought we'd get here, Stacy whispered. I pulled her close. We earned this. She smiled, then added, I used to think being strong meant taking every hit and staying. Now I think it means walking away before you break. Days later, a letter arrived. No return address, but we knew the handwriting. Patty. She wrote that her cancer was in remission. She was living upstate, trying to change, hoping we were happy. There was no ask, just an acknowledgement. Stacy read it, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. Want to write back? I asked. No, she said, but I hope she meant it. And that was that. There was no dramatic closure, no big reconciliation, just a quiet line drawn and peace on the other side of it. We stayed in the beach house. Stacy launched her own design firm. I started teaching part-time, fixing up the place in between lectures. We filled the walls with laughter, music, and everything Patty had tried to steal from us. Every Sunday, we'd write one line in a journal, just a snapshot of the week, good or bad. Stacy booked her biggest client, dreamt of her again, but woke up calm. We danced in the kitchen. The house became more than shelter. It was proof that healing is possible, that love doesn't mean surrender, and that the most powerful family you'll ever build is the one you choose, protect, and fight for together.